The BBC should be commended for setting up what became a model of broadcasting not only in Africa, but also beyond. This model has fostered quality broadcasting and the watchdog role of the press. But what is the BBC's colonial legacy? And how does the public broadcaster serve a post-colonial media space? We are back again on the book series with the editors of the BBC's Legacy in Africa, Continuities and Change.
Let me now get us into a discussion of the findings. I would want to really give you an opportunity and to understand what were the major findings of the book. So if you can give some very specific examples from very specific chapters of the book, that would be very great. I'll start with Dr. Gunde. This is your time.
Yes, as Dr. Sharra has pointed out, and Jimmy as well earlier on, there were multifaceted findings, and I'll just point out a couple of case studies from our colleagues. For instance, from one chapter from our colleagues who wrote from Nigeria and Benin. It has been found that the BBC legacy has had footprints and legacy in various African media houses. For instance, in Nigeria, the usage of Yoruba and commenting about sports programs in the languages such as Yoruba. So what they're doing there is like they adopted the style that the BBC has, but now it's reflected in using their language, and now they have actually modified it to suit the audiences there, so that at least they use the style of the BBC, but in a language in which the audiences can really ably understand and connect with. Okay, we're finding that also in Malawi, one chapter by Dr. Chimwemwe Chavinda is talking about specifically about the issues about culture. Okay, so he focuses more about the influence of the BBC and cultural values and all that in that respect. So we have had kind of multifaceted findings which are of great interest. Some have had an influence on managerial practices, an influence on cultural trends, and an influence on also how they have been modified using the very same style, but then modifying it to the contemporary trends in the African media audiences. So they will adopt, for example, the style that BBC has used over the past decades, but then what is going on now in Africa, then modify it to suit it accordingly. But originally, you find that they still trace it to how the BBC broadcasts. And I think it was Jimmy, who pointed out earlier about issues like hard talk. But now replicating such, okay, having some kind of host on radio and television, but replicating the BBC's hard talk shows and all that. So you can see quite an influence, which I think was pointed out that even those who were in launching our own local broadcast media houses, even the public broadcasters, they would train through the BBC by inviting trainers. Others would actually send them out there. So these have kind of left some footprints within our African media system. So these are some of the major findings that have been unearthed from this publication. But perhaps I would also maybe extend it to Dr. Sharra, maybe to add some points on that.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gunde, for that. I think it captures really the some of the key findings in the book. And I think just to add on that, I think one of the major findings is that, as Jimmy rightly put it when we are opening up, to say this book is not limited to the Anglophone countries, because colonized by the BBC, but also its influence across the Lusophone and a number of countries. So what we are saying is that I think one of the findings is that while the BBC has, so I think I'll start with the first perspective to it, of the role of or how the BBC influenced broadcasting in non-British territories. I think we have got a paper that is on Mozambique's chapter 9, in which the author is trying to show us on how the BBC systems influence broadcasting in Mozambique. So, and at this particular time, the most interesting part with this finding is that the broadcasting in Mozambique started way before the BBC. And similarly, even in South Africa, the radio was already there. But now the way it came within the region, and it ended up influencing the broadcasting in Mozambique. The key question is now how. So we see now that's the power. So it's now telling us to say, when we are looking at the role or the influence of the BBC, don't just focus on the countries where they found it, where they started broadcasting, but also can you go in other countries and so appreciate the influence. So we are arguing in the book, especially in the introduction chapter, to say Britain was not the only colonial superpower at that particular time. We had France, we had all these other countries. But then why should we pay attention to the BBC? So the BBC becomes a focal point. Why? For one main reason. One is that the British colonized many countries than all these others. Secondly, is that they really invested a lot in the colonial project through broadcasting. Unlike other colonial powers, like for instance the Portuguese, the French, and so forth. This is why the BBC was able to influence broadcasting in Mozambique, because the Portugal had not yet seen this as a space to invest more. So it allowed the BBC, when it was coming in, it allowed the BBC to override the private radio station that were thriving at that particular time and set the narrative and the tone. So we see that in Mozambique. That's a very good close example. And we also see the same example from Benin in a paper that is studying Nigeria and Benin. So Nigeria is an Anglophone, but now it was able to influence the narrative or the broadcasting systems in Benin. So it means that the legacy of the BBC, it transcends the boundaries that we have always known to think like it was just a British and a British project within the British colonies. But no, its impact has transcended those boundaries. And then beyond that, we also see, I think, like when we look at the systems of broadcasting that were designed by the BBC, Jim also might have mentioned that no, it's about the infrastructure itself. So we are talking about the infrastructure, and this infrastructure, we have not come across like well done work that breaks down this kind of infrastructure. So when we're talking about infrastructure, as Jim has said, it's not just about the name. Now, when you go in any country, if you go in most African countries, you find that there are programs that are called like drive time. But in an African space, what is drive time? People are not driving. Most people don't drive. It's just maybe 5% of the people drive. But you've got drive time. That's an infrastructure of the BBC. So we are telling people to say, look, there's this infrastructure that is still here. And then on the other hand, one of the major findings that we are also trying to advance in this book is that although the BBC has been successful with some of its systems in Africa, some of them are struggling. One of the systems that is struggling, or broadcasting system that is struggling, is the public service system. So BBC is really designed as a public service, and the difference between the BBC and the thriving private radios that they found in Africa was that the BBC came with the public model. So by having a public model, it was not commercial. It was about serving the people. So that's why it was embraced and loved, and even override the power of the private radios. But then the problem is, yes, public broadcasting service has to work, but then it has to go also with context and politics of a particular region. And in Africa, the democracy, or the independence and the democracy, especially what happened on Independence Day, changed the chances of the public service media to work because of the politics that was created. So when we are reading about the independence speeches of the people who are fighting for independence, the kind of Africa that they wanted to create is so clear. But now when they took over the power, the kind of Africa that they started to build became something different. They wanted to monopolize power, using the military to threaten everyone, abolish the private media, only keep one media, which was a state media. And because now they wanted to use that media now to advance their own narrative and what they call the state building project, now they killed the chances of the state broadcaster to become a public service broadcaster. And was shown in that book to say in most of the countries, if you go to South Africa, SABC already uses Broadcasting Corporation BC, which is an infrastructure of the BBC. If you go in Malawi, you find that Malawi Broadcasting Corporation is also using Broadcasting Corporation, an infrastructure of the BBC, but is the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation following the public service broadcasting model? It doesn't. So we've got a paper like the one from Zimbabwe, chapter 12 in the book. It shows us that the public service model has failed in Zimbabwe. We also have got another one from Malawi, should be chapter 11, also tells us that the public service has not also worked so well in Malawi. So like when you look in sub-Saharan Africa, you find that the SABC tried, but they still also struggles with the state power for them to really operate as a public service model. So we are looking at all those that have worked, but we're also seeing some of the things that have not really worked. And then there are reasons, like in most of the chapter, there are reasons, that one of the reasons is the one that I've just said, the political influence and also the wishes of those people who are in power to control the media. And then there's a lot more that we have to do, because now we have got more private media. And we have got those reports that are coming out showing us to say most people in different countries, they tune in or they like watching or listening to private media, not the state media. And then you go in other countries, you find that people, although the state media is still being used as a state infrastructure by those in power, many people are still tuning into the state media. So there are those questions that we still need to explore as we're trying to understand the history of this legacy, and also the opportunities, the chances that stand in our way for us to dismantle that legacy. I may need to call in Jimmy also to give in 2 or 3 more findings from the book.
Thank you so much. Mr. Jimmy?
Yeah, thanks, Albert and Anthony. I think from what my colleagues saying, you can actually see here that we are talking about something that is lingering. Perhaps maybe Albert has emphasized more on the question of the failure of public service model because of different political environments that we find ourselves in. But I think it's also important to mention that despite this fact that now most African countries, we have sort of pluralist media where there's thriving community radios, a lot of private institutions. It's important to mention that the BBC still is the beacon. Everybody looks up to the BBC for several reasons. One is it's become very common. It's really actually almost something that you cannot argue about. What is the radio about? Everybody talks about radio. It's for them to inform, educate, and entertain. And these are BBC sort of founding principles. It's become something that really defines radio everywhere you go. Now, the question about African correspondence, I think Albert mentioned this in chapter 4. What you see from there actually is that there is pretty much a consensus that the BBC has helped to sort of African media to come up with some sort of professional way of doing things. By saying that, what it means basically is that a lot of journalists, young journalists, practicing journalists, tend to look up to those who work for the BBC basically as their role models. So as BBC continue to train Africans, as Africans more and more joining the BBC, I think this is one of the things that the BBC has also done. Instead of just sending or parachuting reporters to Africa to come and report and whatnot, they are working with African-based journalists. So they have, for example, a studio in Nairobi, where BBC Focus on Africa is actually produced. These are fellow Africans. So they become role models for the rest of journalists on the continent. So you find out that there's that continuity where journalists still look up to these as standard ways of doing things. It has its positives, as I'm saying, perhaps maybe the question of standard way of doing things and all that. But there are also actually arguments apart from the BBC workers, BBC correspondents themselves, to argue that sometimes that model can be restrictive because, African, we have this sort of storytelling, narrative-based way of doing things, and not just straight to the point. News is for 3 minutes, you do it for 3 minutes and then it's gone. So you lose something out of it. But generally, when you look at all these, yes, there's a discussion that we have to have. But what is emerging really, perhaps, is an opportunity for developing something that you can call a hybrid model, something that works from an African perspective, and something that we can also borrow from the BBC that one can work for us. So, for example, we know the public service model has failed. Why should we continue with that? And when you look across Africa, you find out actually the policies are the same. We provide 3 different types of licenses for commercial radio, for community radio, for public service media, when public service media is not going to work. So it provokes these discussions to say, can we be realistic about what we need to do, so that we have a broadcasting service basically that can achieve something that is achievable. So it's important from this perspective to look at the BBC as something that has provided normative broadcasting model, but that may not necessarily work in practice. The question is, how can we benefit from it while looking for something that can also benefit from an African perspective? Thank you.